Have you ever uttered a word in life that's not fair? Sometimes it's a small thing. As kids, we learn to say those words that when your brother gets a bigger piece of cake than you got, that's not fair. When mom and dad won't let you stay up late enough to watch the end of the ball game, that's not fair. Sometimes it's bigger deals. It's you getting a ticket for something because somebody else didn't drink, they cut me off and I rear-ended them and I got a ticket. It's not my fault they cut me off. That's not fair. We have this kind of innate sense of how things are supposed to work. And when something is right and when something isn't right. And we tend to know when things are not fair. However, for the most part, that sentiment extends about as far as our arms can reach. Usually when we say that's not fair, what we mean is that's not fair to me. We tend to be less concerned with whether or not that was fair to our neighbor or to the person across the street or to whoever. It tends to be me and my folks. That's not fair to us, rather than that's not fair in general. We're working through this series here where we're talking about the idea that Jesus is Lord. And we're asking this question: what would we value? What would we hold as most important? What would we exalt and say, this is what it looks like to live, if the primary thing that formed us in life, the thing that had the most influence on our heart, was our relationship with Jesus as Lord of our lives? And so last week we talked about this value of life, that there's this innate image of God written on every human being. We should treat people with that kind of dignity and respect. And today I want to introduce this word, justice. That to be a follower of Jesus as Lord means that you believe in justice. But not the kind of justice we talk about today, the kind of justice that the Bible holds up. A justice that extends further than our arms can reach. A justice that looks at the people around us and sees when life's not fair to them either. A great example of this is someone by the name of Harriet Tubman. You probably remember learning about her in like 8th grade history class. Harriet Tubman was born in 1822 in Maryland as a slave. She lived approximately 30 years on a plantation with all of the cruelty that comes of being a slave in the 1800s. All of the brutal work, the punishments, the whole 9 yards. And finally in 1850 she escaped and made her way to Pennsylvania where she found freedom. And I don't know about you, but most folks, after 30 years of living on a plantation, when they finally got their freedom, they would have kept their bags packed and kept heading north, right? Further up, further in. We're getting away from this. We want nothing to do. We're not going anywhere near those lines where we could end up back in captivity. But Tubman decided that for her, it was not enough that she had her freedom if her family and friends and people that she had spent years with were still enslaved. And so instead, the reason you know her name is because she is perhaps the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad. She made 13 trips back into slave territory, leaving more than 6 people to freedom over the next decade of her life. She risked what she had found. She risked her own freedom, her own safety, her own prosperity, because she looked at the world around her and said, that's not fair for them either. This is what biblical justice looks like. Biblical justice is those who have safety and security and prosperity, looking at those whose life has not been fair to, and choosing to go and rescue them too. I could spend the next 20 minutes explaining the idea to you, but I came across a video several months back made by the folks at the Bible Project. And because they get to use cute little animations and practice and rehearse it, they're going to say in about 5 minutes what would take me most of my sermon to say. So I'm going to let the folks at the Bible Project introduce you to the idea of biblical justice and biblical righteousness and what that looks like for us.
If you were a praying mantis, it would be socially acceptable to devour your mate.
And if you're a honey badger, you have no regard for other animals. You don't care.
If you're a panda with twins, it's normal to abandon one to take care of the other.
But if humans do any of these things, we would call it wrong, unfair, or unjust.
Yeah, why is that? Why do humans care so much about justice?
Well, the Bible has a fascinating response to that question. On page 1, humans are set apart from all other creatures as the image of God.
Yeah, God's representatives who rule the world by his definition of good and evil.
And this identity, it's the bedrock of the Bible's view of justice. All humans are equal before God and have the right to be treated with dignity and fairness no matter who you are.
And that would be nice if we all did that. But we know how the world really works.
And the Bible addresses that too. It shows how we are constantly redefining good and evil to our own advantage at the expense of others.
Yeah, self-preservation. And the weaker someone is, the easier it is to take advantage of them.
And so in the biblical story, we see this happening on a personal level, but also in families, and then in communities, and in whole civilizations that create injustice, especially towards the vulnerable. But the story doesn't end there. Out of this whole mess, God chose a man named Abraham to start a new kind of family. Specifically, Abraham was to teach his family to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice.
Yeah, doing righteousness, that's a Bible word I don't really use, but what comes to mind is being a good person.
But what does that even mean, being good? The biblical Hebrew word for righteousness is tzedakah, and it's more specific. It's an ethical standard that refers to right relationships between people. It's about treating others as the image of God,
With the God-given dignity they deserve.
And this word justice, it's the Hebrew word mishpat. It can refer to retributive justice.
Like if I steal something, I pay the consequences.
Exactly. Yet most often in the Bible, mishpat refers to restorative justice. It means going a step further, actually seeking out vulnerable people who are being taken advantage of and helping them.
Yeah, some people call this charity.
But mishpat involves way more. It means taking steps to advocate for the vulnerable and changing social structures to prevent injustice.
So justice and righteousness are about a radical, selfless way of life.
Yeah, and you find this idea all over the Bible. Like here, in the book of Proverbs, what does it mean to bring about just righteousness?
Open your mouth for those who can't speak for themselves.
And what do these words mean for the prophets, like Jeremiah?
Rescue the disadvantaged, and don't tolerate oppression or violence against the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow.
And like here, look in the book of Psalms.
The Lord God upholds justice for the oppressed, gives food to the hungry, and sets the prisoner free. But he thwarts the way of the wicked. Whoa, he thwarts the wicked?
Yeah, in Hebrew, the word wicked is rasha. It means guilty or in the wrong. It refers to someone who mistreats another human, ignoring their dignity as an image of God.
So justice and righteousness is a big deal to God.
Yes, it's what Abraham's family, the Israelites, were to be all about. They ended up as immigrant slaves, being oppressed unjustly in Egypt. And so God confronted Egypt's evil, declaring them to be rasha, guilty of injustice. And so he rescued Israel. But the tragic irony of the Old Testament story is that these redeemed people went on to commit the same acts of injustice against the vulnerable. And so God sent prophets who declared Israel guilty.
But they weren't the only ones. There's injustice everywhere.
Yeah, some people actively perpetrate injustice. Others receive benefits or privileges from unjust social structures they take for granted. And sadly, history has shown that when the oppressed gain power, they often become oppressors themselves.
So we all participate in injustice, actively or passively, even unintentionally. We're all the guilty ones.
And so this is the surprising message of the biblical story. God's response to humanity's legacy of injustice is to give us a gift, the life of Jesus. He did righteousness and justice, and yet he died on behalf of the guilty. But then God declared Jesus to be the righteous one when he rose from the dead. And so now Jesus offers his life to the guilty so that they too can be declared righteous before God, not because of anything they've done, but because of what Jesus did for them.
The earliest followers of Jesus experienced this righteousness from God, not just as a new status, but as a power that changed their lives and compelled them to act in surprising new ways.
Yeah, if God declared someone righteous when they didn't deserve it, the only reasonable response is to go and seek righteousness and justice for others.
This is a radical way of life, and it's not always convenient or easy. It's courageously making other people's problems my problems.
This is what Jesus meant by loving your neighbor as yourself. It's about a lifetime commitment fueled by the words of the ancient prophet Micah. God has told you, humans, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you is to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
There's a lot to unpack there. I want to start where they began by talking about the difference between retributive justice and restorative justice. Retributive justice is something we're all very familiar with. You commit a crime, you do the time, right? So for hypothetical, someone is a child abuser, there should be a punishment for that, right? We can argue about what the severity of that should be, but they should have a consequence for what they've done. Whether that's imprisonment, whether that's being removed from their family, whether that's beating them with a stick. Whatever you think is appropriate, there should be some type of consequence for treating a child that way. That is retributive justice. And many of us, when we think of justice, we stop there. That is part of biblical justice. Part of biblical justice is the people who do these things will have consequences for their choices. But it never ends there because it recognizes in a situation like that, that that's not real justice. That you can send someone to prison, but what about the 4-year-old who's had his life wrecked? Who's going to help him? Who's going to provide counseling for him? Who's going to provide a safe home for him? Who's going to teach him how to trust again? Who's going to teach him how to be loved again? Who's going to provide safety and healing for that child who's been taken advantage of? That is restorative justice. Justice that doesn't just seek to punish those who've done something wrong, but seeks to restore those who have been hurt by injustice. And this is the kind of justice that is written all throughout Scripture. But we're going to look at just 2 of the passages they mentioned in that video. The first one is in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 3. It says, "This is what the Lord says, administer justice and righteousness." Well, how do we do that? What does it mean to administer justice and righteousness? He says, "Rescue the victim of robbery from the hand of his oppressor. Don't exploit or brutalize the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. And don't shed innocent blood in this place." That trifecta there in the verse is probably the most common refrain when it comes to justice in the Old Testament. That you would protect the alien or the foreigner or the stranger in your land, depending on how it's interpreted, the fatherless or the orphan, and the widow. Widows, orphans, and immigrants, over and over and over again, are lumped together in these verses about justice in the Old Testament. Why these 3 groups? Because they were the 3 most likely to be taken advantage of. They had no political rights. If someone wronged them, they couldn't go to court. You're an outsider. You don't belong here. You can't sue anybody. You're a widow. You have no husband to speak on your behalf, and you have no legal rights. You can't own property. You can't have a job. You can't do anything. You're just here. You're an orphan. You have no dad to protect you or provide for you. No one to speak up on your behalf. No one to defend you when a criminal comes. These were the people who had no privileges, no rights, no protection, no provision. And so over and over and over again, the Old Testament prophets, the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Proverbs, say, you want to do justice? Speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. Provide for those who can't provide for themselves. Care for those who can't care for themselves. And the 3 groups that are often lumped together are the immigrant, the fatherless, and the widow. And it's not just in the Old Testament. We see the same thing in the book of James. James 1:27 says this, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." So the first thing to understand about doing justice is that it involves looking at those who have somehow been hurt or wounded and cannot help themselves. What does that look like in 2024? Well, we can start with the same 3 categories. It could be a refugee who's here from another country because their home has been destroyed by earthquake, by war, by famine. They don't speak the language, they don't know the culture, they don't have any family. They may be in need of help. It could be the fatherless. It could be kids who are in the foster care system, who need a place to stay, who need someone to care about them, who need to welcome them into their home. It's our family story, right? We understand that probably better than most, of what it's like to take somebody in and say, you are now my son, and I'm going to raise you as such. It could be helping the widows, We have some folks here who've done incredible work with some of our older folks through my 7.5 years here, where there's been somebody who's passed away and we've got somebody in their 80s or 90s with no kids around, or no kids willing to step up to the plate, or no siblings around. And we've helped pay for funerals and take people to doctor's visits and provide care and help plan end-of-life things. That was not our responsibility because it's not my mom, it's not my grandma, and yet here's someone who has no one to care for them, and people in this church have stepped into that role to care for them. So it might look like the fatherless, the widow, or the immigrant. It might also look in today's world like a single parent. To be a single parent today, trying to work and get your kids through all the things that need to happen, is nearly impossible without a support system. And some people are fortunate enough to have friends and family around who will help take care of them. Some people are not. So it might look like picking kids up from school, or providing food, or providing free childcare, or whatever for that single mom or single dad that you happen to know. It might look like taking care of kids who have parents in the home, but parents who don't really want to be parents. Much of my ministry and youth ministry was spent working with kids who lived with adults in their home but didn't really have any parents, if you understand what I mean. And in 16, 17 years of youth ministry, we had kids live in our house for certain seasons. We helped kids apply for college. We taught kids job skills. I taught kids how to drive cars. I did budgeting with people because they didn't have anybody in their life to do it. Now, I never tried to be their father. I saw them as fatherless. And that if someone didn't step in and give them a hand up, they were never going to make it. If someone didn't step in and say, I'm going to do for you what somebody else should have but is not, they were never going to make it in life. And biblical justice recognizes that we live in a world where there are a lot of people that if no one helps them, they're not going to make it. Either because of something that happened to them individually, because their parents abandoned them, because somebody they loved died, because somebody was abusive toward them, or because of things in our system and culture, because they go to the wrong school district, because they live in the wrong place, because they live in a city where there's not help. But either way, if someone does not intervene, their chances at a long, successful, fruitful life are almost zero. Our world is full of such people. And biblical justice looks at those people and goes, I can help restore what is broken. The second verse I want to look at specifically that they reference there is in Micah 6, chapter 8. He says it this way there. He says, mankind, he has told you what is good. And what is it the Lord requires of you? To act justly, to love faithfulness, and to walk humbly with your God. I want to give you a little bit of context for this passage, and then I want to come back to it, because this is one of my favorites. In the preceding verses, God basically puts the nation of Israel on trial. The first 3 or 4 verses of Micah 6, he calls the mountains and the trees to testify against Israel. To testify to the fact that they have not taken care of the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. They've not practiced justice. They have been selfish. They've built up their own wealth. And he basically goes, you guys are guilty and you know you're guilty. And then in verse 5, they ask the question, well, how do we make it right, God? How do we fix this? All right, we recognize we're not perfect. We've broken things. What should we do? And he asks some absurd rhetorical questions like, should we bring a whole mountain full of goats to kill? Are there enough goats in the world for us to bring and sacrifice to satisfy our sinfulness? Should we bring rivers full of oil and burn them on the altar? If we brought an entire river of oil and burn it as a sacrifice, would that be enough, God? He even wonders if perhaps we should bring our own firstborn son, the way some of the ancient gods required. And the answer to that question, what should we do, God? How can we make this right? Is Micah 6:8. God isn't interested in your sacrifice. He's not interested in how many goats you bring. He's not interested in how much oil you bring. He's not even interested in your firstborn. He has showed you, oh man, what is good. This is what God wants you to do. To act justly, to love faithfulness, and to walk humbly with your God. A couple of things about that verse to help us unpack it. I love this verse in part because it's one of the clearest places where you understand what Old Testament and even New Testament justice is really about. He does not say, talk about justice. He does not say, think about justice. He does not say, become outraged at injustice. He says, act justly, or probably more accurately translated, make justice. It implies that in order to keep this command, you must get up off of your backside and actively participate in bringing about justice to the world. It's not enough to sit back and go, I didn't do anything wrong. It's not my problem. You must actively be a participant in the bringing restorative justice to the world. You got to do something. Do justice. Act justly. Make justice. And he says to love faithfulness, or yours might say love mercy. That word there that is translated faithfulness and mercy is the Hebrew word hesed. It is the word used in the Old Testament to describe God's faithful, loving kindness. So really what he's saying is, if you value the loving kindness of God, if you love God's love, if you love the way God's mercy has been in your life, then the response to that is to walk humbly with your God and to make justice. If you recognize that God has shown immense mercy to you, that you have undeserved favor from God, then the appropriate response is for you to do that for other people. Make justice because you value God's loving kindness and you want to walk humbly with your God. And I think this is where the disconnect is for a lot of people. It's one of the things, if you wanted to, we could blame social media. I will, but it's probably been around longer than that. Social media gave us this ability to be outraged about things, and because we were outraged about them, we felt like we had actually done something, right? So we read the news story about child sex trafficking, we share the article, we tell everyone how angry it makes us, therefore I've done my part. But you've not actually done anything to help. You've just expressed outrage. We read about the way a city's been overtaken by people. We read about injustice of some sort, whether it's racial injustice or it's financial injustice or it's political injustice, and people are being mistreated, and we post the video and we go, this is awful, and we feel like we've helped. And we've done nothing but feel outraged and make sure everybody knows we feel outraged. When the Bible speaks about doing justice, making justice, it does not leave room for you to simply be angry at the injustice. It calls you to go and help fix the problem, to restore what is broken. And maybe this analogy will help. Imagine for a moment that you have been inherited an old school building. You are now in charge of a charter school. Yay for you! Everyone's lifelong dream, doesn't that school look pretty? Some people are like, I can have that school. No, yours only had one room. That'll be a slow burn. I'll give it a minute. You inherit this school building, and because it was built in like 1925 or whatever, it is not up to code in any way, shape, or form. In particular, it's not what we would call accessible. There are no wheelchair ramps, there are no elevators, there are no handicapped bathrooms, the doorways are too narrow. It would not pass code. And let's say hypothetically, in your beautiful charter school here, you have a half a dozen students who are in wheelchairs. Now, when you first inherit the building, it's okay for you to say, it's not my fault. I'm not the one who built the building. I didn't build the doorways too narrow. I didn't not put stairs in instead of a ramp. I did not leave room for an elevator. I didn't do this. I just got the building. But there comes a point, right, where you've been in charge of the school for a decade. If there are still no ramps for wheelchairs, and no handicapped bathroom stalls, and no doorways for them to get through, it kind of is your fault, right? If you're there and you see the problem, and you see the lack of accessibility, and you do nothing to fix the problem, you're kind of a jerk. You're not a very nice person. You're certainly not a good person. You don't have to look very far to see the brokenness of our world, to see what drug addiction has done, to see what mental health has done, to see what violence has done, to see what poverty has done, to see what child abuse has done. You'd have to be blind to not see it. So let me ask you a question. If you see it, and you do nothing, what kind of person does that make you? If you can see the injustice, and you can see the hurt, and you can see the brokenness, and you do nothing, what does that say about your character? What does that say about your faith? What does that say about whether or not Jesus is really Lord of your life? It is not enough to simply be outraged at the things that are happening. Jesus came to heal what was broken. And then he looked at us and said, go and do likewise. And part of the reason there's a disconnect here is we live in kind of a you break it, you buy it culture, right? You remember being a little kid and your parents would take you on vacation, like in the store with all the blown glass vases or the little pottery thing. They'd be like, don't touch anything, because if you break it, we have to buy it, and I can't afford to buy it. I usually add, I'll have to sell you in order to pay for it, but that's... You ever wonder why they take 4-year-old kids into stores like that? Like, what are we thinking? We're like, yes, I'm going to bring you into the store, or if you bump into the shelf, it's going to cost me $1,000. That's a dumb idea, but we live in this world that's like, well, you break it, you buy it. And so when we look at the problems of the world, we have a tendency to go like, well, I didn't break it, why should I have to fix it? It's not my mom. I take good care of my mom. I check in on my mom. When the day comes and my mom needs help, I'm going to be there for her. Why should I have to take care of your mom? That's not my job. I didn't abuse that kid. Why should I have to pay for his counseling? It's one of the disconnects we have when we talk about racial things, because we go, well, I'm not a racist, so why should I care about racial reconciliation? Because the world is full of racists, and the world is broken. And just because you didn't break it, doesn't mean you shouldn't try to help fix it. This is the gospel story. And the problem that we run into is this idea that we shouldn't have to pay for other people's problems. And when we say that, we go, well, Jesus shouldn't have had to come to pay for our problems. Right? The American story is, I'm going to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. Right? That's the image we use. I'm lying down in the middle of the field, I got nobody around to help me, I'm going to grab the little strap to the back of my boots, which, by the way, I'm not nearly flexible enough to grab my bootstraps when I'm laying on the ground. Maybe some of you could actually do that. But the idea is, I'm going to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. Hard work, good work ethic. I'm going to overcome my family. I'm going to overcome my poverty. I'm going to overcome my situation, and I will make it. And some people actually can do that. There are some amazing stories of people who live that life and proven that to be true, and it has become the American story. But the biblical story is this. I was a sinner who was so far from God that I could never find my way back. And if God had looked at me and said, Josh, get your life together, and then maybe I'll save you, I would have had no hope. My hope, as the video highlighted so clearly, is that Jesus would come for me, that he would do for me what I could not do for myself, and that he would restore me to a right relationship with God. Not because of my goodness, but because of his. And so when he says, go and do likewise, what he's saying is, there are people who are hurt and broken and suffering all around you. Don't expect them to do what you could not do, Josh. You couldn't fix things on your own. Why do you expect them to do it? Reach down, pull them up, and restore what's there. And here's the part that's hard. It's costly to do that. It's the great irony, because it's not fair. I shouldn't have to pay for somebody else's mistake. It shouldn't cost me because somebody else didn't do their job as a parent, or as a child, or as a whatever. But in this case, I choose the unfairness. I choose the broken. I choose to sacrifice. And I will pay the price so they might be made whole. That's what Jesus does. And that's what he calls us followers to do too. And so we have to be very careful as we walk through this season of life, as we look at the political spectrum, the cultural spectrum, and the national landscape, to not give our voice and support to people who will further injustice, who will further push people down, who will further hurt people, who will further make things worse. And I understand, and I mentioned last week, it's nearly impossible to make a choice on a national level that doesn't hurt somebody. You just can't do it. To help one group is by nature to harm another. But we as Christians must call out injustice wherever we see it. We must call it out wherever we see it and say, that's not right. We don't talk about people that way. We don't treat people that way. We don't value people that way. We want to help those people. Why? Because it's what God did for me. I love because he first loved me. We must be the people who do justice, who love God's loving, faithful kindness, and who walk humbly with our God every step of the way. As Christians, we value true, restorative justice, the kind that Jesus showed us on the cross, the kind he calls us as we walk with him. So what's that mean for you? Any number of things. If you're looking for a place to get involved with child trafficking, check out Rafa International. We shared their video last week. They do amazing work on the sex trafficking trade. You can volunteer your time, volunteer your money, volunteer your voice to help what they're doing. We got a heart for those who are struggling with addiction. We do a lot of work with Beneath the Shade, helping women recover, not just from their addiction, but their goal is to restore them to their identity in Christ, that they may return to being mothers and wives and active citizens of our community. You can drive cars for them, you can donate financially, you can go cook meals, you can help with training. There's all sorts of, we're working on a house right now. You want to wire up a house or put down flooring or put in toilets. They've got work to be done at this new house that they're building. There's all sorts of ways to plug in and connect with them. We've got a heart for kids who become orphans. Our foster care system is full of people who need a place to go. We've got a heart for kids who maybe have parents in the home but need that mentorship. We've got Big Brothers, Big Sisters. We've got T4C that has a Big and Littles program where you can sign up to mentor a high school or junior high student. There are countless ways for you to actually do something. Countless ways for you to actually do something. What's not acceptable for someone who really believes Jesus is Lord is to see the injustice and to do nothing. To see the hurt and to do nothing. Imagine a different version of the story where Jesus sits in heaven and goes, man, Father, it's so awful that they messed up your creation. There's so much hurt and suffering down there. I just wish it would get better. And then he went back and pulled out his phone and played video games. Because Jesus likes him not to let go. Imagine a God who saw and did nothing. That's not our God. Our God saw, and he came, and he rescued. And over and over and over again, he says, you love like I loved, you serve like I served, you give like I give, you do as I have done.